Hello, everyone, and welcome to our horse talk today. We asked Erik Molvary, the executive director from Western Watersheds Project, to come back and talk to us a little bit more about land leases. He did a great presentation that we had during our summit, and he talked about land leases a little bit as a way for us to utilize that as a way to advocate for wild horses. So I was going to have him just talk a little bit, and then if you guys have questions, just please put them in the chat, and we will get to them after he's done talking. Thanks again, Erik, for being here.
Sure thing. And thanks, Chris, for hosting. And we'll start with a little historical overview of leasing public lands for livestock grazing. And originally, when the United States settlement came west into the interior West, the federal government took charge of the public lands, and there were a number of homestead acts under which the livestock industry, but also farmers and other kinds of settlers could homestead 160 acres of land at a fairly cheap cost. I think initially it was 25 cents an acre, and they would get title to that land. And later, those homestead acts expanded that amount of land that you could homestead through the stock raising homestead acts and other succeeding acts. And it was bumped up to 320 acres and then to 640 acres ultimately. And in the West, during settlement in the Intermountain West, where it was arid, what you had was a pattern of settlement in which basically all of the springs and seeps and water courses got homesteaded so that the ranchers um, could kind of claim title to all the water. And the reason for that is that at that time, all the rest of the land that was unclaimed was called the public domain, and anybody could graze it, and there wasn't a charge for it. And so it was kind of a big free for all out there on the unclaimed lands. And the ranchers basically were in a scramble to try and control those federal land grazing opportunities by controlling the water, because if you keep the other person's livestock the um, off of the water, then they couldn't access the grazing on the land. So that was the big game, was to try and control the water. And then over time, there were these competing interests. There were these landed ranches that got started mostly with cattle, that were trying to control the public lands. And then there were these what were called tramp herders, usually Basques, and they were usually following big herds of sheep, hundreds of thousands of sheep to a herd. They would follow them with sheep wagons, and they would just wander around through the public lands. For example, in Wyoming, there were big herds that were wintering in the Red Desert, and then they were trailed up through the Wyoming range and would land at lamb their sheep in the Wyoming range, and then summer them all through the Gros Ventre and the Wind River range as they migrated around in a big circle to land back in the Red Desert again in the winter. And the landed cattlemen didn't like the tramp herders. They felt like the tramp herders didn't have any land they were tied to. And so they could just go and drive their sheep anywhere they wanted. And when the sheep came through, it was like a big herd of hooved locusts that would just wipe out all the grass in its path. And so they'd come through and wipe out all the grass. And then the ranchers that were stuck tied to these ranches didn't have any grass to graze their cattle. So in 1911, the Rock Springs Grazing Association in Wyoming actually filed a lawsuit to try and stop these tramp herders, and that didn't really take, but it did lay the groundwork for the Taylor Grazing Act in 1934, which was a later congressional law that was enacted in large part to solve this rancher led problem of these tramp herders that were coming through. And so the Taylor Grazing Act did all kinds of different things. It set up grazing districts. It laid the groundwork for public land livestock leasing, but it required, in order to get a lease, that you had to own property. And so, since these Basque tramp herders didn't own any property of their own, they didn't have a base property that they could use to apply for a public lands livestock grazing lease. They couldn't graze on public land anymore. And so with a wave of the wand in 1934, the Taylor Act, Grazing Act got rid of these tramp herders. And that was the primary motivation. Even though the Taylor Grazing Act was kind of wrapped up in a bunch of language about the Dust Bowl and overgrazing and the need to manage grazing on public lands, what it was really all about was getting rid of these sheep grazers for the benefit of the cattle grazers. So it was a big kind of a range war, basically, and that was kind of the close of that range war. It really wasn't until the 1970s, in response to a lawsuit by the Natural Resources Defense Fund, that the federal government actually went about dividing up the public lands into different grazing allotments and assigning those allotments to individual ranchers. And at the time, the individual ranchers thought that this, kind of allotment system was a major imposition against them, and they fought against it, but they lost that battle, and so the public lands were divided up into these grazing leases. And today, the grazing leases cover 90 or 89 or 90% of the Bureau of Land Management lands, plus a little over half of the National Forest lands. So basically, anything that you could graze a cattle on, that you can graze a cow on, became part of these grazing leases. And the initial grazing fee was $1.23 per animal unit month. That's a cow calf pair. And that was later raised to $1.35, which was the legal minimum that was baked into the Public Rangelands Improvement Act in 1979. And that act prescribed a formula that allowed that grazing fee to fluctuate above that $1.35 minimum. And over time, it got up almost to a high point of about $2.50. And then it came back down again because the formula is kind of a crooked formula. It's never yielded a fair market value for the taxpayer of the amount that land is worth if it were private land being leased for cattle grazing or sheep grazing. So anyway, you have all of these grazing allotments that are out there. In addition, there are a lot of state lands in the western states, and often the states were granted by the federal government during their statehood acts either one or two sections per what's called a township, which is a square that's 6 square miles by 6 square miles with 36 of these square mile sections, and the state would either get one or two sections, usually section 16 or 36 would be given to the state. And the states often would lease their state lands for livestock grazing. And that's a completely separate process administered by usually the state land department. And they charge typically more than the feds do, but they vary state by state. And it varies state by state whether non-grazing entities can lease those states competitively. In Idaho, it happens that you can lease a state grazing lease, and Western Watersheds Project has competed in the lease bidding for two different sections, which we won, and we currently hold those leases. In addition, you can buy a grazing lease that is a federal grazing lease from its owner. And this is typically happens when a ranch is sold. So usually when a ranch is sold and there are grazing leases associated with that ranch because the ranch is the base property, usually those grazing leases go along with the ranch and are sold with the ranch. In addition, those can be separated out and you can buy that grazing lease on public lands from the ranch. And in recent years, the typical price has been $250 to $300 per animal unit month as the fair market value for buying one of these grazing leases. Even though a grazing lease is actually called a grazing permit, and it's a little complicated. What you're buying is what's called a preference, and the preference basically gives you first dibs to have the lease. And the way it operates traditionally, in fact, is that it might as well be a lease that is 10 years in its term and is renewed virtually automatically to the company or individual that holds that lease. And it just keeps rolling over and rolling over and rolling over and rolling over. The agency is supposed to do a NEPA process and an environmental assessment every time it reissues a grazing lease and look at the environmental impacts. In practice, what has happened is that Congress has provided a loophole called the Section 402(c)(2) loophole, which was originally called the grazing rider, in which the agency, the Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management, can roll over that lease under exactly the same terms and conditions as the previous lease without doing a NEPA if that agency doesn't have enough personnel or time or energy or funding to do the NEPA process. And in point of fact, about 67 to 75% of those grazing allotments are being renewed under this grazing rider. So they're just getting rolled over time after time after time after time under exactly the same terms and conditions. Now, there are organizations, conservation organizations, sometimes sanctuary type organizations that have bought grazing leases. And when you buy grazing leases, there are two kind of pathways. If you hold a federal grazing lease, there are regulatory requirements that basically require you to put livestock out on that grazing lease for 7 out of every 10 years. And on 3 out of every 10 years, you can generally take what's called voluntary non-use. But you can't just take that voluntary non-use forever. Sometimes you can, but that's up to the discretion of the agency, and often they will be sticklers and say, no, you have to put cows or sheep out onto that land, or sometimes they'll allow bison to be qualified for that, or horses. And depending on the field manager, they get pretty broad discretion. And if you don't, if you hold that grazing lease and you don't graze it, they'll take it back and they can give it, even though you bought it and paid for it, they can take that back away from you for not having the use of it with livestock, and they can give it to a different rancher. So there are penalties for buying it and not grazing it. And the other pathway is if Congress has provided that that particular area can have what's called voluntary grazing permit retirement. In other words, if a conservation group or other entity buys the grazing permit and then surrenders it back to the federal agency, then if that area is in that grazing permit retirement area, and Congress has said that any grazing permit that is forfeited back to the agency is permanently retired, then you can buy that grazing allotment and return it to the agency, and then there will never be any cattle on that grazing allotment ever again. And that's true for the Boulder White Clouds Wilderness Designation area in Idaho. It's true for the Owyhee Canyonlands Wilderness area in Idaho, but not in Oregon. And it's also true for some national monuments administratively. It's also true for, generally speaking, national parks, because the national parks don't really have a legal framework that allows for commercial grazing on national park properties. So in those areas, generally speaking, you're pretty safe if you buy a grazing allotment that is held by a rancher that can be permanently retired. So those are the general parameters of grazing leases, and I'll go ahead and open it up for questions from folks.
Thanks for sharing that, Erik. So how can we utilize this to help wild horses?
Well,
Because
there is one group that is called Rewilding America Now that has bought a base property and some grazing allotments in northeastern Idaho, and they are trying to convert that permit to allow them to graze bison and wild horses on those federal grazing allotments that are associated with the ranch that they bought. They're having some challenges with the bureaucracy. because the bureaucracy initially said, yes, we'll let you convert those permits, which were permitted for cattle and horses, to bison and horses instead. But then the Region 4 Forest Service range con decided that he didn't like that and he wanted to back the livestock industry's desire to keep everything in livestock if possible. So he is, I think, obstructing their ability to do that. It is also true that I have heard of a wild horse group that has been gifted a grazing permit, and they're now trying to figure out, how best to manage that grazing permit that they were gifted by the permittee, who was a supporter of theirs. So these things can be kind of complicated, and they're difficult. And also, there is legislation, national legislation called the Voluntary Grazing Permit Retirement Act, or VGIPRA. It's got a very catchy acronym, VGIPRA, that has been proposed by Representative Adam Smith of Washington. And that is a piece of legislation that would allow grazing permit retirement nationwide on any federal grazing permit that is bought by a conservation entity for a wild horse entity or any other entity, and then surrendered back to the federal government. It would provide for that permit retirement. That is a piece of legislation that has been introduced. It's been introduced a number of years in a row, hasn't passed yet. But I think that with each passing Congress, the odds of passage become a little bit greater, and we'll see where it goes.
So how easy would it be for us to acquire a land lease? Because I would guess that we would be battling with yearly cattle grazers, that were getting their permits for that. So how available are permits like this, I guess?
Well, I think any permit can be bought for the right price, generally speaking. There are a lot of ranchers who want to sell. A lot of ranchers would like to be able to retire someday. Of course, the first choice of these ranching families is generally to pass the ranch management and the federal grazing permits off to their offspring and have their kids take on the ranching business. But as the children of these ranching families watch their parents struggle to try and survive and make a living at livestock, which is a very difficult thing to make a living at, especially with kind of there are these feedlots and big slaughterhouse combines like JBS and Hormel that are basically almost like cartels that price fix and make it hard for the livestock producers to get a fair market price for the cattle when they sell them because there's so few. It's almost like a monopoly of the meat packing industry. And so it's hard. And if it's a bad rain year and it's a drought, then your cattle have not gained very much weight, or your sheep haven't gained weight and they're not surviving well and struggling, and you're not going to make money in those conditions. Or if the price of beef due to the market fluctuations is down that year, you might lose money. You really have to have a perfect set of abundant rainfall and high beef prices in order to make money at ranching. And every other combination of conditions, you're losing money. And so it's not very profitable for an individual family ranch operation that's small. And so often, when the kids see this, they don't want to get into the family ranching business. They want to move to Tulsa and become a dentist or go to Denver and get into tech and something where they can, have a bit better opportunity to make a living. I remember once I was in Steamboat Springs, Colorado, for a summit that was organized by cattle producers about wolf reintroduction. And the USDA Ag Extension agent came and gave a presentation and said, hey, if you take all the ranches in the Steamboat Springs Valley area, the average cattle herd size is 78 cattle. And the average cow, when you take it to market, will get you a profit of $300 to $400. Well, if you pencil out the math on that, you're finding out that the average year, the average rancher in that valley might be making, $20 to $24,000 a year, and it's pretty hard to make a living at that. So, it shows you how marginal economically these operations really are. So, if you've got a grazing permit and you've got a home ranch and you're getting into your 60s and your kids don't want to take up the business and you're getting too, frail and stove up to be able to continue to do it anymore, then you've got a problem. And because ranching is not that lucrative, you tend to be land rich and cash poor. So, in other words, you might have land holdings that are worth, upwards of $1 million, but you might not have very much in the bank. And so, if you decided to retire and stop ranching, then you wouldn't have enough money to survive as a retiree. And it's a pretty bleak economic prospect. So, under those conditions, you might have a rancher that looks to monetize their public lands ranch operation and maybe sell the federal lands grazing permit and get a few $100,000 so they can retire comfortably, or maybe even $1 million, depending on how extensive their holdings are. And then keep their home ranch and their base property, and maybe even keep ranching on that on a really small scale. But it's something where I think you can find a lot of ranchers who are open to the possibility. The reason the livestock industry writ large fights against this so hard is because the big lobby groups like the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, the Public Lands Council, those organizations, get their political um, kind of capital and their political weight from having lots and lots of these ranchers in their ranks. And, as these ranchers leave the public lands and don't want to be in that business anymore, that lobby dwindles away in its political influence, and they don't want to. So they want to stick around and have their jobs as lobbyists. So they fight very hard against it, even though their member ranchers have it in their interest to have the option, because with this grazing permit retirement and the ability to sell their leases, that's something that is a benefit to the rancher. And hey, there's nothing that legally requires them to sell. They can keep them as long as they want. And it's only an optional, voluntary decision for them to sell if they choose to do that.
So how often, like when they buy a land lease, how long is that lease good for, I guess is one question.
Well,
Or does it depend?
each lease is typically, the typical lease term is 10 years and then it gets renewed. But it's very traditional for these leases to get renewed and rolled over to the same rancher that owns the preference on the grazing permit. So, I mean, you can almost look at them as if they last forever, because from a practical standpoint, they kind of do until they get sold.
So Krista says, so much great information, thank you. So she's asking, so to buy a land lease, you can work with the rancher who owns it, and then the government can't stop the sale of the permits between a person and an organization or the ranch that the rancher owns.
That's true. I mean, it's a private transaction, and the agency can't control that. Now, once you hold the lease, then the agency can determine whether you get to keep it or not, based on whether you're actually using it by running livestock on it. And like I said before, you can take voluntary non-use for 3 years out of every decade, and the agency can't stop you from doing that, but they can require you to run cattle or sheep on that lease for 7 out of every 10 years. And if you don't have the wherewithal to do it, or you don't want to do it and you don't do it, then the agency can claw back that lease and then give it to a different rancher. Even though you owned it previously, they can say you're forfeiting it because you're not stocking it with livestock under the terms of that lease.
So could we, like in a hypothetical situation, get a land lease, try to get a land lease from either the BLM or a rancher in the Red Desert and just say, I'm allowing wild horses to graze on it?
Well, that's a really interesting question. And it would seem like you could do that But in point of fact, wild horses are not considered livestock. And unless you had title to the animals, then you couldn't. And another complicating factor would be each lease is designated for a certain type of livestock, like either sheep or cattle and horses, or sometimes cattle or sheep. And so you have to run those same kinds of livestock. And since wild horses are not considered livestock, then you can't just say, well, we're just going to graze them with wild horses that are already out there. The agency would not accept that as a legitimate use of that grazing permit. And one of the really interesting kind of examples of this controversy is happening right now in Montana with the American Prairie, which used to be called American Prairie Reserve, which was a nonprofit that started buying up ranches and buying up grazing leases for the purposes of converting the leases from cattle to bison, which used to be pretty easy to do because the agency would say, well, cattle and bison are pretty much the same and equivalent. And so we'll just go ahead and convert you from cattle to bison, and you can run your livestock as your bison as livestock. And in fact, in Montana, under state law, bison can either be treated as livestock or wildlife. So there's that legal designation of bison as livestock in Montana that gives the American Prairie the ability to say, hey, these are livestock, and I'm going to go ahead and run those on this federal grazing permit as livestock because I'm legally allowed to do that. Now, for American Prairie, when they came up for the renewal of their grazing permits, they've been grazing bison for years on American Prairie grazing leases on federal public land, and it's never been a problem. But then Doug Burgum, under this Trump administration, decided that when the ranchers protested the leasing of this these grazing leases for bison, um, Doug Burgum decided that while these protests were in front of the Office of Hearings and Appeals and the Interior Board of Land Appeals, in those two administrative law courts within the Department of Interior, there's a special regulation that allows the secretary to what's called take jurisdiction over the appeal and take that appeal away from the judge, the administrative law judge that's ordinarily sitting, dispensing justice for those appeals. And the secretary can take that away from the judge and decide it him or herself. And Secretary Burgum did do this for these grazing permits that were being renewed by American Prairie for bison, rolling them over from a bison permit to a bison permit. And Doug Burgum said, "No, you can't lease those and run bison anymore because you're not leasing those lands for the purposes of production of bison meat. You're leasing these lands for the purposes of conservation of bison, and that's not a legitimate use of these grazing leases." And of course, Doug Burgum was just making that up. There's no regulation or under the Taylor Grazing Act or any of the additional BLM regulations ever since that has said that you can't run bison primarily for the reasons of conservation and restoration of bison, and that you have to have production. That's not a thing. Doug Burgum was making it up. But now that's probably going to be heading to the court system, and it's probably going to be tried in front of the courts. And I wouldn't be surprised to see Western Watersheds Project be one of the plaintiffs that's challenging the Interior's decision to interfere with American Prairie's restoration of bison on their federal lands grazing lease, because um, by God, those bison and the restoration of bison as a native wildlife species on these grazing leases has major environmental benefits and major benefits for public recreation. And it's in the public interest to do that, versus it's not in the public interest to rent these grounds out to the livestock industry. So we're supporting American Prairie in this effort, and I wouldn't be the least bit surprised to see us all go to court in defense of their ability to run bison as they have in the past. And the other thing that's really interesting is that the Bureau of Land Management in the past has said, yes, you can run bison on these leases. Here are all the reasons that this is perfectly legal. And in fact, when we look at these protests that the ranchers are having to say that it's not legal, those protests don't have any merit because all these different legal reasons why you can do it. And so now the agency is reversing its course over what it has kind of concluded for many years for these same grazing leases. So when the agency does that and it changes its mind without a reasoned explanation, that's what's called arbitrary and capricious and an abuse of discretion. And that's illegal under the Administrative Procedures Act. So all kinds of legal controversies swirl around this decision to not renew the bison. But I think that does bear some relation to the idea of, can you rent these public lands or own these grazing permits and use those for wild horses? Unfortunately, under today's legal constructs in terms of the BLM regulations, you can't do it. That's not to say that the BLM couldn't change its regulations and allow that to happen. I think they could under the laws that are there today. And there's also no reason Congress couldn't step in and say to the BLM, you have to allow the grazing permits to be used for wild horses if they're out there on the same grazing permits land. Congress could step in and say you're required to allow this use on a grazing lease, but Congress hasn't done that either yet. So that's what the situation is for. Can you buy a grazing lease from a rancher and then let that lay fallow and let those grasses stay out there for wild horses or any other herbivore? I mean, even if there are no wild horses, could you buy the grazing permit and allow that grass to grow and be eaten by elk and mule deer? And the answer is no, unless you have that ability to retire that grazing permit permanently, because Congress has given authorization in a particular area to do that.
There just always seems to be so much contradiction in what they say, like under the Department of Interior as a whole, and then the agencies of the BLM and the Park Service, because the National Park Service has a huge bison conservation initiative they've been working on for years now. And we hear about that a lot at Theodore Roosevelt National Park. And as you know, too, the park came out and said the horses had to leave because they were livestock. So how can one agency have one set of rules and the other one not? Not that we want horses to be livestock, but if they're livestock in the park, why can't they be livestock for the purpose of my grazing permit?
Yeah, and it all gets down to the legal nitpicking of the laws that apply to that agency and the regulations that agency has made up for itself to implement that law. So, in other words, Congress makes the law. The agency can't change the law once Congress makes the law, and the law rules, right? That's the most authoritative kind of level of governance, is the law itself. But then, if there's any ambiguity about how that law is to be administered or carried out by the agency, then the agency gets broad flexibility to do what's called rulemaking, and it can make up its own regulations for that particular law. And different agencies may make up different regulations depending on their different perspectives on how they want to manage their units of on their land. So you can end up with some very different legal interpretations in Theodore Roosevelt National Park versus maybe Bureau of Land Management lands in the Dakotas that surround them.
Wow. So Sherry wants to know, how can we find a land lease to purchase or lease?
Well, it's tricky. You have to get to know the ranchers in the area, and you have to figure out, who holds the lease. And there is a Bureau of Land Management database called the RAS database, RAS, that will tell you who owns the leases. And then you have to figure out how to get a hold of those people who own the lease. And that can be tricky because the Bureau of Land Management doesn't make it easy for you by, providing a phone book or emails. You have to do some sleuthing, but you have to find out who owns the, kind of the grazing permit, and then you have to approach them directly.
Right, and Krista wants to know, so in the example you shared where a wild horse group was gifted land, can they lose it then and not be able to use it for wild horses? Is that a possibility?
That is definitely a possibility, and that's there on the horns of a dilemma. And, to kind of make this dilemma more real for folks, there is an organization called Grand Canyon Trust, who a number of years ago decided they're going to get in the business of buying up grazing leases and trying to reestablish bison on the Grand along the Grand Canyon or rest them from livestock. And what Grand Canyon Trust learned to its dismay was that once it owned these grazing permits, it needed to get into the ranching business in order to keep them. And so it did. Is in the ranching business in a sort of limited way, so that it can keep a hold of these grazing permits while it tries to work through how to wangle that system toward conservation outcomes, and it can be very tricky.
Hey, Terry wants to know what qualifies as the minimum number of livestock that you would need to have grazing to avoid forfeiting the lease.
That is a really good question. And the federal agencies have what's called broad discretion, or what I would call unlimited latitude in what they require on each grazing lease. So, I mean, you could make a pretty good argument today on any grazing lease that's out there that, hey, we ought to cut the number of cattle and sheep in half just to have healthy lands and fewer invasive weeds. And if you had a range manager for the Bureau of Land Management or the Forest Service who agreed with you and said, yes, you're right, let's cut back these numbers, then you might get them to. Or you might have a staunch ally of the livestock lobby as your Bureau of Land Management or Forest Service range manager who's taking their marching orders from the industry and their lobbyists. And that um, that range manager might be quite curmudgeonly and say, no, you have to put every single cow out there that the previous rancher did, or you're going to lose your lease because he's trying to get you to cough up the lease, and he wants you to lose it. And so the idea that you can expect fairness and even-handed treatment from different range managers in even the same jurisdiction is a bit of a kind of a rosy lensed outlook on the way these agencies really operate. You're at the mercy of their judgment and their best judgment, and if they decided their best judgment is to make your life hell, they're going to try and do that. And there's not a whole lot you can do about it.
Terry says if it's a matter of economic value, tourism has value, as does environmental protection. So as you mentioned, livestock is not at all that viable. So would that be a valid argument, I guess?
That's
I
a
know to
very
you it
valid
would
ar-
be.
that's a very valid argument. Now, it's not that there's no law that says that the agency has to put the land to its highest and best and most productive use. And so, if there was a law that said you have to devote this land to the use that causes the biggest economic value for either the federal government or the local community or state economy, then every acre of land would have no cattle or sheep on it because recreation is always 10 or more times the value whenever you have an economist look at it objectively, and you look at the economic pittance that these ranchers produce versus the huge amount that the tourism economy brings in from people, everybody from hunters and anglers to people who are camping or people who are hiking and people that are bird watching or wildlife viewing, or I mean, you go out, there have been studies done in Yellowstone that variously attribute the amount of money that wolves cause in terms of tourism, just the wolves by themselves, and the numbers they come up with range upwards of $35 million a year for wolves. Just having wolves in the park people draws people from all over the world to go see them. And the slice of that park's tourism income, which is in the billions, that's attributable to wolves, is anywhere between 35 and maybe $85 million a year. Um, but there's no law that says the agencies have to manage the public land for the maximum dollar output. Now, some state constitutions say that the state lands must be managed for the greatest dollar output. And in those states where conservationists have been able to force this point through the Supreme Court of that state, Idaho is one example. Western Watershed Project's predecessor, Idaho Watersheds Project, actually took the state of Idaho to court when they wouldn't let us bid on the grazing allotments and leave them vacant for the purpose of conservation. And we argued that, hey, under the Idaho Constitution, the state lands must by law be managed for the maximum dollar income to the state educational trust account. And because the state was blocking us from putting in a higher bid, then the state schools were getting less money to educate their kids because the state was discriminating against us in favor of the ranchers. And the Supreme Court agreed with us in several consecutive rulings. And so we got the ability to rent those state lands and leave them vacant of livestock, which we've done in a couple different land leases. So, I mean, it's possible that there is a legal construct that prioritizes economic output, and some states have that, but the federal government does not have that. And so you get this rather ridiculous upside down priority system in agencies like the Bureau of Land Management and the Forest Service, in which the economic pipsqueak on the block, the one that produces the least amount of economic benefit from its use and often has the greatest economic or environmental impact, is prioritized, while the tourism and the public recreation, which is producing the greatest amount of economic value for the economy, is neglected and is given the back seat and is in fact harmed by putting the livestock out there. It's one of the paradoxes. And so it's a good argument for Congress. It's a good argument to tell your congressional representatives, hey, look, why are we managing these public lands for livestock production when that's economically irrelevant, when we could be managing it for all these other values, including wild horses, which probably have a much greater economic value. And I think that's a valid, logical argument to make.
And I have a question. So if we're saying like the ranching industry is really essentially kind of dying, right? It's a dying industry. Um, Families aren't wanting to, take that up and carry on the family names. And there's all these issues. Or like you said, they have like land money, but not always real, like tangible money. How is it that they end up so powerful in the lobbying? Do you know what I mean?
It's because of the good old boy networks in these rural Western states. And the in many cases, the state legislatures have were set up at the time when territories became states to be biased in favor of the livestock industry. For example, in Wyoming, they have what's called a citizens legislature. In other words, they don't actually pay their legislators a any wages to go to Cheyenne and for a month or 2 months, depending on which year it is, and be a legislator professionally. They pay a little per diem to cover their food and lodgings. It's not very much, but they require them to take off the month or 2 months without a paycheck. And go serve in the legislature. Well, who can afford to do that, really? If you have a day job, you're gonna, is your day job going to let you take 1 to 2 months of vacation and then pay you? Probably not. And so the ranchers, heck, during January and February, they've got nothing to do anyway, right? They have very little work to do on the family ranch in the dead of winter. So they can afford to go to Cheyenne. So the legislature was set up to kind of discriminate between people that run for office, between ranchers and everybody else, and set up this this system. And if you look at the county commission systems, which are typically kind of the um, the bench for the legislatures and the congressional races, those county commissions are often made up heavily of ranchers and their interests, because the people who are voting in the county commission races are typically the rural people, because the people who live in town are focused heavily on their city council, because that's who really heavily affects their quality of life and what they do. but the county commissions are just really out there determining how much money to spend on roads and bridges and where the county road should go. And the people who live in town don't care that much about that. So they don't vote in those county commission races. So who votes in them? Well, the ranchers. And then those county commissions are dominated by ranchers and politically wedded to the interests of ranchers because those are their voters and constituents primarily. And then when it comes time for the county commission to be a cooperating agency for the Bureau of Land Management District or for the forest, the National Forest, they take that constituency's interests to that federal agency and they lean on that federal agency to do things and for the make do favors for the ranchers. And that's how it happens. I mean, it's a big good old boy network all the way across. And
Hmm.
and then of course, if you're a governor, if you're running for governor, you probably your history is that you started as a county commissioner, then went to becoming the legislature, and then you went to the governor's seat. You ran for governor's office, and if that's the case, then the odds are pretty good that you came out of a livestock background too. So it's a big kind of incestuous political ecosystem.
Wow. So Sherry said, if I have 40 wild horses I've adopted and I'm looking for a land lease for them in Southern Oregon or Idaho, any ideas how expensive it would be to lease 50 to 100 acres?
They don't lease by the acre, they lease by the animal unit month. So each horse is one animal unit. And so depending on how long you want to lease them for, there are some leases that are set up to be leasing the land for 3 months or 5 months at a time. Some leases are year round, about a third of them are year round. And typically, you'd be looking at buying a permit that costs you about $250 to $300 per animal unit month, right? For those animals. So that's the upfront price of acquiring the lease. And then once you are on the lease, then the rent that the agency charges is a pittance. So right now it's $1.69 per horse per month. And that is the fee that the agency charges once you own the permit.
Wow. All right. Does anybody else have any other questions? This was really fascinating. So thank you, Eric. We appreciate it. And thank you everyone for coming in. We're going to have another horse talk on Wednesday, a little bit more fun talking about the year of the fire horse. So make sure you sign up for that. And yeah, great information. Thanks as always, Eric. It's always great talking to you. We appreciate it. Thank you,
Happy to be
everybody.
here. Thanks, Chris.